You have heard that it was said to those of old, You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, You fool, will be liable to the hell of fire.
So our text reveals the first of this phraseology that we're going to see in the next few weeks, which is, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Jesus is not correcting the Old Testament. The it that he is correcting is the interpretation of the Old Testament. And at this point, we know Jesus is banging on the Pharisees, the religious leaders. If you want to think about super pastors, that's who these guys were. And so it's easy for us to go, oh, he's talking to the Pharisees. Well, actually, he's also talking to us because we are religious people, and religious people misunderstand and misrepresent and misinterpret the Bible. And so he is not denying the authority of the Old Testament. He's correcting the interpretation. He's not denying the reality that we have some understanding of Scripture, but he's trying to correct our understanding of this idea of anger, this concept, this confusing, emotion that is good sometimes and not good at other times. He's getting underneath our understanding of what it means to be angry. And what he's really doing is he's trying to get us to see that anger grows into something in our lives if left unchecked. That anger produces something akin to murder. And he's trying to get us to deal with it. Now, anger's hard to admit to, isn't it, right? I mean, when's the last time you said out of your mouth, I'm angry? Most of the time you don't say that. You'll say things like, well, I'm frustrated. I'm irritated. I'm agitated. Other words with tated, right? We don't say I'm angry, because to say that you're angry kind of feels like you should actually do something with it. And most of the time when we're angry, kind of this low grade kind of anger and bitterness that a lot of us walk around with, we don't really want to deal with it, so we just use words like frustration. And so it's hard to admit, and it's hard to understand that we're angry. And you would think, some of you are like, yeah, it really is, Darrin, so the Bible's going to clear all this up. Well, I don't know. You be the judge. This is Ephesians 4:26 in the New Testament. It says, in your anger, do not sin. So question, is anger a sin? Well, yeah, but no. So, everything clear now? Right? It is, but then in cases it isn't. It's very difficult to discern. Anger can be righteous, and anger can be unrighteous. Anger, in its purest form, has its source in God himself. Now, all you got to do is read the Old Testament to get this. Old Testament. Who's ever tried to read through the Old Testament? How'd that go for you? You get stuck. Sometimes you get stuck in Leviticus, like mixed fabrics and all this crazy ritual. But one of the things philosophically that you get stuck at is you just see how angry God is at sin. Which is why some of what are called progressive Christians, you may be one of those, says, you know what, I don't really care for the Old Testament. I'm a red letter Christian. I like what Jesus says, right? Jesus is nice, and Jesus is sweet, and Jesus is so comforting, and he's got my back. He's my homeboy, right? So Old Testament God, yeah, but New Testament Jesus, he's so nice, and he's so sweet, and he's so kind. Well, is he? Are you sure? Have you read the red letters? Have you read the Gospels? Like, Jesus is literally coming to worship, and the text seems to suggest he makes whips and starts whipping people at church turning over the tables, right? Just freaking out. Why? Because they had made God's house into a place of commerce instead of worship. Jesus, when he heals somebody on the Sabbath, and apparently it's not good for supernatural things to happen, at church and in some religious leaders' minds. And so he looks at them with anger. So he gets angry, he looks at people with anger, and then he speaks words of anger. Matthew 23, Pharisees, you are twice the sons of hell. And I don't quite know what that means, but it's not good. I understand this one, you're snakes. Jesus was angry. Jesus was a man of anger. You know why Jesus was a man of anger? Because Jesus was a man of love. When the good is threatened, the right response is anger. Jesus is angry precisely because he's good. God gets angry precisely because it's good. If you don't get angry when good is threatened, you are not acting like Jesus. So anger in its purest form can be righteous. It is from God. But listen, okay, can we talk here? Most of the time when I'm angry, it ain't righteous. It's not because the good is threatened. It's because I threaten and I'm not good, and then I get angry. And so what we're talking about when we talk about anger is really difficult. But remember, all of these concepts that we're dealing with, we'll talk about lust next week. We're going to talk about marriage and divorce the next week. We're going to talk about revenge. We're going to talk about our words. All of these things are in context of this thing called the Sermon on the Mount. So let's pan out. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is inaugurating his new kingdom. He's saying, I'm coming to you with a different way of looking at life. There's a different set of values. There's unique perspectives. We have a different king now. And so I'm going to form a people. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is speaking to. I'm going to transform a people who do things differently. They're like an alternative city within whatever city they find themselves, where they do money differently, where they do their sexuality differently, where they do their finances differently, and where they do their relationships differently. So much so that the world looks in at this city on a hill and says, there must be a God around here somewhere, because look at how those people love. Look at how those people live. And so some of you ask, what's the journey about? That's what we're about. That's what we want. We want a people formed, shaped with a different set of values that do things in a distinct manner, not because we're trying to be cool, hip, trendy, trying to get people to look at us, but we're trying to get people to look at Jesus. And so our community wants to look like Jesus. So what happens if you keep coming to this church and get plugged in? We hope you're going to resemble Jesus. That's what the church is supposed to be. So that's what the Sermon on the Mount is calling us to. And then let's tunnel in, because specifically what Jesus is saying is, my people do anger differently. My people understand that the definition of anger that most of the world operates with is too thin. It doesn't get underneath. And Jesus is always trying to get us to see the sin underneath the sin. He's trying to get us to go deeper. We want to stay shallow. He wants to throw us in the deep end. And boy, is he doing it with anger. And the punchline is this. I don't want to bury the lead. The punchline is this. Anger grows like a little acorn in the fertile soil of the human heart. And if it's nourished, it grows into a murderous tree. And so anger is murder-like, specifically when it comes to how we look at our relationships, specifically when it comes to people. You have heard it said, but I say to you. What is the it? What is the it in verse 21? Well, we know it's not the Old Testament. He's not saying the Old Testament's bad. He's saying the way you have interpreted the Old Testament with regard to anger and relationships, that needs to be corrected. Because what you have said is, as long as I'm not killing someone, we're good. As long as I'm not plotting your death, I don't need to worry about how we're relating. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. I got to take you deeper. I got to throw you in the deep end. I got to show you how dangerous it can be to be unrighteously angry. I got to show you that you're actually a murderer and you don't even know it. That you're doing prison time even though you haven't been convicted. I got to show you. And so he says in verses 21 and 22 that we commit murder. Now these are people, right? This is alternative kingdom. We commit murder when we have contempt. When we have contempt for one another. Now, contempt is my word. Jesus doesn't quite say it that way, but what I want you to see is that's what he's really saying. Look in verse 21, Matthew 5:21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Now here's a progression. Did you see it? Anger, insult, fool. Anger is this idea of boiling, like the water's boiling. Hebrew understanding, here's where anger starts, in the gut. And then the more angry you get, it kind of comes up your body into your neck. You ever see somebody really, and their neck's like red and the veins are kind of, and then somebody who's really angry, Hebrew understanding, it comes up to your face and out down your nose. And somebody who's really, really angry, their nostrils flare. Which is why in the Old Testament, over and over again, it says, God, you are slow to anger. And the Hebrew word, this is awesome, the Hebrew word for slow to anger is long of nose. God has a long nose. What does that mean? It takes him a long time to get angry. But it all starts here. That's the word. This boiling, the water's just beginning to boil. And then here's where anger works. And this is how you say, I don't know if I'm angry. Watch your words. Because if you're insulting people, and we usually don't insult people to their face because we're cowards, right? So we gossip behind their back. Same thing. That's what I was talking about. You're hurting people with your words. You're maligning people's reputation. You're suggesting things. You're being political with certain comments around certain people to make other people look bad. That is what he's. So you go from this to like the words come out, and then the last stage is, you fool. That's like bad. Like, no, here's the word. It's the word raka, which means you're nothing. That's what you fool means. You're nobody. You're a non-person. You're not important enough for me to give my time and my energy. You're nothing to me. You're nothing. And so this is the progression of anger. This is what happens when you're in an unreconciled relationship. This is what happens when people basically in and around our lives get our sneer, feel dismissed. And you felt that, right? That's happened to you. They didn't call you a fool, but you felt it. What is that? It's contempt. So my wife and I just finished a marriage book. So if you have felt like strangely prompted over the last few months to pray for our marriage, you were listening to God, because all you got to do to have conflict in your marriage is like write a marriage book, and it's just been awful and wonderful. It's going to make for a great book, but it's been hard, right? So we've been writing this book, and God's made us live it all out, which really stinks. I'd rather just like write stuff and preach stuff and not have to live it, but that's not the way God works. And so we've done all this research, and we discovered this incredible concept called the Love Lab, which sounds like something I shouldn't be talking about in church, but actually here's what the Love Lab is. The Love Lab was a kind of a research environment set up by the name of a guy named John Gottman. Gottman, since the 80s, has taken about 5,000 couples to the Love Lab, and the Love Lab is basically an interviewer with a couple, asking them questions about their marriage, and they're doing it to try to discover why people love each other, why people stay together, why people divorce. And get this, Gottman has gotten so good at discerning what's happening in the couple, if he doesn't even have to be the interviewer, if he just watches the video of a couple, he can predict with 1 hour watching them with 95% accuracy whether or not they'll still be married and whether or not they will divorce. 95% accuracy, 1 hour. Now, if he just watches them for 15 minutes, he can predict with 90% accuracy. You're like, how did this guy? Here's how he did it. He said he's identified 4 horsemen that destroy marriages. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of divorce are defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and then the last, which is contempt. Contempt. And Gottman says contempt is just basically code word for disgust. You know you are contemptuous when you're relating to a person, you only focus on the negative, not the positive. You literally ignore the positive. And he has found when couples get to that point of contempt, they're done. 9 out of 10 times, after looking at them for 15 minutes, after an hour, 95%. Contempt is when you say, you fool. Contempt is when you look at someone and say, you're not worth it. This is what it means to have unreconciled relationships. We commit murder when we do that. Now, here's what contempt does. It causes us to settle for unreconciled relationships. See, when contempt is kind of operating in and around your life and you kind of get used to it, then you just go, well, it's no big deal. And especially if you grew up kind of in a broken home, like I did. So, grew up in a home where there was violence, and you just kind of, get used to that. Kind of get used to fighting. You're always kind of looking over your shoulder and kind of checking the scene out, and you guys know what I'm talking about. You're just and you're never really relaxed. You've always kind of got a fighting posture. Like early days, we had a nonverbal specialist come in and help me not look like I was trying to street fight when I was preaching, which fairly helpful when you're trying to be a shepherd. He's like, dude, you're preaching. It looks like you're ready to throw a right hook. And I'm like, yeah. That's kind of how I've been living. He's like, I know, we got issues. Like, that's not good. And so, like, working through all that, I became a Christian. And you know how it is when you get the real thing? Like, you really get saved, like, to the bone. Like, God changes. I mean, he doesn't change everything immediately, but one of the things that changes is that whole kind of violent. I was just like free from, I don't even know how to describe it. It was just gone. And I was a fighter, and now I was a lover. And I just love people. And all the church and people were smiling, and, and I'm like, this is so awesome. These people in this church, when they have a problem with each other, they don't get physical. They don't lay hands on each other in an unbiblical manner. They actually talk it out and work it out. And I was under that delusion for about a month that that's actually how the church worked. And then I realized that no. They may be not physically violent, but there's a lot of unreconciled relationships that these folks are just settling for. And I was like, I don't understand that. That is amazing to me. And I'm like, why is that? And I was so judgmental early on. And then I just lived a little longer. And I started seeing it in my own life. But Jesus tells us why we do this. This is why when you read these passages where Jesus is going after the Pharisees, and this is on the heels of him doing that, Matthew 5:20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you're not going to get into the kingdom of heaven. Well, this is why when you read those passages, you've got to say, I am a Pharisee. Because this is the reason we settle for this as religious people. Look in verse 23. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. So Jesus is saying, okay, you're in the middle of worship. all of a sudden God puts it on your heart. Listen, you've got this unreconciled relationship. You say, well, I'm just doing the God thing. I'm just going vertical. Listen, you go vertical, God's going to make you go horizontal. You know why? Because Jesus says the core of Christianity is you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. You love God and you love people. So you start like trying to love God, God's going to start trying to get you to love people. You get reconciled to God, God is going to call you to reconcile with others. He just does that. So Jesus is pointing out this dynamic. But here's what we do. And this is why we settle. Because we get so busy doing religious activity that we use it as an excuse to not reconcile with people. You ever do that? Have I gone from preaching to meddling? Well, I'm reading my Bible. Well, I'm going to church. I'm taking communion. Yeah, you're using those things. This is what the Pharisees, they used religious activity to avoid doing the hard thing that God was asking them to do. And the hard thing that God asks us to do, certainly at times He calls us to extraordinary faith. Most of the hard stuff He asks us to do, friends, is to deal with these crazy people in our lives that have hurt us. And in humility to go to them when we've hurt them. And so we settle. And Jesus is saying, don't settle for just doing the vertical thing. Let that, as you're really engaging God, be sensitive. Don't get in like ritual mode. Be sensitive to that He's always going to spread you out to the people that are in and around your life or that used to be in and around your life. That's just how it works. Don't settle. I've got, several people like this in my life. As a pastor, what happens is you don't mean to, but you hurt people deeply. Like you didn't pray, you didn't stay around and pray, and they really wanted to pray with you, or you said, hey, let's do lunch, and then you forget, or the church is too big and you can't meet with everybody, and you really connected and you really wanted to, and then you had a conversation, and a pastor was too harsh with you when they should have been gentle, or they were too gentle with you when they should have been more direct. I mean, we pastors hurt people all of the time, and it is so easy to justify that. Like so it's so easy if you're just a Christian, but I'm just like, well, I'm preaching a sermon on anger, Lord, we're good. Don't make me go and deal with all these hurt people. That's a black hole I'll never get out of. And yet the Lord says often, as I'm in corporate worship and private worship, you need to call this person. You need to pursue this person. You need to send this person a text. And Lord, I haven't talked to him in 5 years. I know, but I'm God and you're not. Do what I say. I know, but if you trust me, fruit is going to happen in and around your life. So this is just the way it is. And I think when we're authentically worshiping, we know it because God's going, you need to go deal with that. So if that's not happening, I think Jesus might be questioning our worship, or at least saying you're using worship to avoid doing hard stuff. Now, what he does in this parable, in this teaching, is he goes from one metaphor to the other. He goes from the familial to the legal, from relationships to jurisprudence. And because he's trying to get us now on the solution side of how we actually kill murder. How do you kill that murderous spirit in your heart? Well, the first thing is you have to identify your unreconciled brother. Some of you don't even know you're settling for them because you've never named your unreconciled brother. Look in verse 25. Verse 25. Come to terms quickly with your accuser. Now he switched metaphors here. While you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. What he's saying is this: if you're being sued and you're wrong, you're at fault, go and try to work it out of court before you get to the court. Because you're going to have to pay the judgment. You're going to have to go to jail. Try to work it out. So he switches from unreconciled brother to accuser. In just a second, he's going to go down the chain and talk about an enemy. He's talking about all these people in the same light. You can say, oh, it's my unreconciled brother. Oh, it's my accuser. Or it's my enemy. Jesus is like, I'm going to tell you how to deal with all of that. First of all, you got to identify him. Who is it? Who is that person in your life that's not in your life now, but should be in some form or fashion? Maybe not as tight and as trusted and as connected as they were, but at least in your heart where you know, hey, I've done what I can do there. Who is that? Identify them. And this is not easy. And this takes a lot of courage. And here's what's crazy about it. This unreconciled, this accuser, this enemy-like person can be under your roof. It can be a rebellious child. It can be a distracted spouse. It could be somebody in your community group. Because it's someone who you feel like is just pushing contrary to your will. Someone who just, for whatever reason, they're just like that irritant, that sandpaper in your life. Someone you're always tempted to give the Heisman to, right? Someone you're always tempted to ignore. Like it's that person, maybe. And so Jesus said, come to terms quickly. Find out your accuser. Like discern who the unreconciled brother, who is your enemy? You're like, well, I don't know if I have any of those people. Well, let me ask you some questions. Maybe this will help. When you think, okay, because as I was talking, it's very likely that a name popped in your head, a face came in your brain, okay? So let's just go with them right now, just for fun. When you think of that person, is the first thing you think of the hurt they caused you or the pain it is to deal with them? Okay? 2, would you help them if you could? So they're in crisis. Would you inconvenience yourself to help them? Do you have anger fantasies about them? You say, Darrin, you need to define anger fantasies. No, I don't. You know what I'm talking about. Don't you? Okay, this is from Ron Edmondson, not from me. This is a great, I've never thought of it this way, but this is so powerful. When did you stop wanting them to fail? See, these people were kind of waiting for God to judge them. Right? Remember Jonah in the Old Testament? Like God's at work on him. He seems to make progress, and then he's like back to where he was, and then he's doing well, and then at the end of the book, he's like sitting outside the city, waiting for God to judge Nineveh and burn him like a crispy piece of bacon. That's how you know you've got unreconciled people, because you're just going, when's God going to get him? When's God going to go after that nonsense? When am I going to be justified? When did you stop wanting that for them? You say, well, I haven't. You just made Jesus' point. So okay, I know who they are. I've identified them. Now what? Well, reconcile. Quickly. Like go as fast as you can and reconcile. Not without wisdom, sometimes not without counsel, but purpose in your heart. I'm going. Come to terms quickly with your accuser. Like, go after this thing. Don't delay. Make it a priority. Stop blowing it off. The rest of the verse that we started the whole sermon with, Ephesians 4:26. In your anger, do not sin. Read the rest with me, church. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. The idea being that you deal with this as quickly and as promptly as you can. There are times, there are situations where you have to consult people and you don't just want to rush in, especially if the wounds are deep, especially if the cost is high, because if this doesn't go well, and all of these are hard because if it doesn't go well, it could break the relationship, you could lose your job, you could put this thing back 5 years, and it's I understand all that, but purpose in your heart. Or if there's not all those factors, go very quickly. Go. Find that person. and then reconcile with them thoroughly. So it's not just like you run up there and you're like, all right, we got to figure this out. Are we good? All right, we're good. No, like get deep into this thing. That's why I love this courtroom metaphor. Because Jesus is like in verse 20, he's like, you're not going to get out of there. If this thing goes to court, someone's going to pay. And the idea is in court, right? There's evidence that's introduced. And lawyers are asking, they're finding out every single thing. And what is the remuneration? And how do we get to that point? Like, it's detailed. It's thorough. Treat this like that. Like your whole livelihood is riding on this. Let's go. One time I heard this. I don't know where. I didn't think of this. But the person said, most people go only so far in reconciliation or in relationships, period. And they fail to go, and this is the language, the last 10%. The last 10%. Jesus is saying, I want you to go to the last 10%. I want you to get there. And how do you go to the last 10%? Well, you go to reconcile thoroughly, and when you go, and this is kind of counterintuitive, you've got to be willing. You've got to be willing to be wrong and even wronged. One of the things that keeps us from reconciling is we go, it's not going to work. We kind of do this cost-benefit analysis. We're like, all right, if I go, then it's going to cost me this much time, and I'm going to have to explain it this. It's just not, and it's probably not going to work either way. They're not going to respond like I want. Guess what? They're probably not. Let's just go ahead and expose that one. Has nothing to do with whether or not you should go. Has nothing to do with it. You got to be willing to be wronged. And this is hard, and this is vulnerable, and this is difficult. Now, read with me verse 38. Let me help you. I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying. Verse 38, okay? You've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who's evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile with him, go 2. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Now, let me explain something about this metaphor, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's actually in the Bible. What you have to understand, in the Old Testament, that was revolutionary in the ancient Near East. Because in the ancient Near East, the way the countries dealt with each other, it was like, or even neighbors at times, you steal my cow, I'm going to burn your city down. That was the way it worked. And so eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was radical. But Jesus is telling us something about how we deal with people when there's conflict. Revenge is not the law in relationships. And especially when you come from an abusive situation, and like many of you are, you see that, or turn the right cheek. We've even had to counsel people. Like, well, my husband hits me. Should I turn the other cheek? No! It's not what the Bible... This is like the slap on the cheek thing. It's like the French guy. I challenge you to a duel. That's what this is talking about. This is insult. This is not abuse. Okay? So what he's saying is, be willing in the process of tarrying with people and trying to reconcile. Be willing to be insulted. Be willing to be wronged. Be willing to be misunderstood. He's not saying don't stand up for justice, which is why we just don't go with the government. Oh, we'll just do whatever you want. You know, no big deal. We're just here. No, we stand against injustice, which is why when there's systemic injustice, like what's happening, you know, in our city with race and issues like that, not particular to the Ferguson issue, but just in general, like we stand against that. We don't just accept injustice. That's why at work, when things don't go well for you, and you stand up. So he's not talking about standing up, not standing up for justice. He's talking about forgiveness. He's talking about the willingness to be wronged. And then he's talking about the willingness to be extravagant. And I use this word so intentionally. Extravagant in mercy. Extravagant in mercy. Keep reading with me, verse 43. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. The hardest part about being a reconciler is there's this thing in your heart that just says they don't deserve it. They don't deserve my words, much less my smile. They don't deserve, and guess what? In some cases, they don't. They sinned against you. And sure, there was something, but it's mainly on them. And this is when we feel most justified. This is when we feel like we can settle for these things kind of being askew. Because we're like, they don't deserve. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you deserve the sun? Do you deserve the, how did you get born? How'd you work all that out? Did you figure that one out? If you did, write a book. You're going to be very wealthy. How'd you choose your parents? How'd you choose to be born? For many of you in the United States, where we have tremendous advantages over other places. Like, you got to get all that. No, it was all grace. Like, you didn't deserve any of it. And yet God was extravagant in his mercy. Well, they don't deserve. I get it. Give them what they don't deserve. It's what God did for you. It's called grace. Give them grace. Willing to be wrong. Give them grace. And then the embodiment or the application of grace is prayer. Prayer is the most radical thing that you can do in reconciliation. Here's why. Because even in a reconciliation meeting, even where you're like, hey, we're coming clean, you can say words. You can even fake the nonverbals. And you in your heart can be totally bitter and angry and being political and not really going to the bone. But when you come before God and you say, Lord, I want good things to happen in the life of this person. Like, you can fake the counselor, you can fake the mediating friend, you can fake the person. You're not fooling God. He knows. And so prayer is the deal in reconciliation. It's the deal that precedes it, it's the deal that makes it happen, and it's the deal that keeps it happening. And you say, well, I'm not sure if I'm unreconciled with this person. How's your prayer life with them? About them? Well, there's these certain Psalms that I pray for them that are really dark and negative. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. Do you want things to go well for them? When did you stop plotting for their demise? When did you stop wishing that justice would come? When did you start praying for mercy? See, mercy is for the consequences of our actions. We're asking God to give us what we don't deserve. There's this old prayer. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Not real creative, but really good. God, I just want justice. Never pray that. You don't want justice, and neither do I. We don't want to get what we deserve from God. We want mercy from God. God wants us to give mercy to others. This thing gets really complicated. You say, okay, so I've went and I've got disconnected family members. My own father, if I can just be so transparent, we've got issues with this. And I feel like I've gone, and he hasn't reciprocated, and I'm in this weird place, and I've talked to my counselor, and I've tried to do whatever. I'm in it right now, okay? And then with other people who have left our church, former staff people, trying to work out some of this stuff. I don't want to stand up here and go, well, this is messy stuff, people. This is not easy. It's not easy. But I think a verse that governs us is Romans chapter 12, verse 18. It says, as much as it depends on us, be at peace with all men. So we are doing everything we can to reconcile, knowing that we can't make someone reconcile. And just because you reconcile with someone doesn't mean you trust them like you did. It just means that you've done everything you can. Doesn't mean you're going to be buddies again. Doesn't mean you're going to go work there again. Doesn't mean any of that. It just means the posture of your heart, the attitude of your spirit is, I want this to be as good as it can be. And maybe it can't be where it was, but at least it could be here. That's what I think Jesus is calling us to. There are nuances that I can't get into because I just don't know your situation, but I know someone who knows your situation. And he is able to guide you. He is able to help you. But you have to humble yourself. And you have to let him in to this hard, broken place. And you have to stop justifying. And you have to stop building a case. And you have to stop, getting a bunch of witnesses who agree with you. And you have to say, Lord, what shall I do? How can I be a reconciler? Now, only do this if you don't want anger to dominate your life. If you're cool with bitterness, cynicism, being negative, don't listen to this. Work your plan. But if you would like to be free, let's let God in. Let's pray. Lord, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Jesus, you didn't come so that we would have perfect lives on this side of heaven. It's just not possible. But you came to bring peace. And we want to be peacemakers. We want to be people who are reconcilers. Man, Lord, does St. Louis need those kind of people right now? Does this world need those kind of people right now? And we are so passionate about the city, and we're so passionate about, some of us, about politics. And Lord, I pray that you would help us redirect that corporate passion personally to our spouses, to our children, to our neighbors, to our former employees, to our people that were in our life that are not. Lord, we don't know what it looks like, but we just want to ask you, Lord, what should we do? What should we do? So, Lord, we'll take some time right now because we understand these are deep wounds. We understand these are complicated issues. And we're so grateful that in just a second we'll have pastors up here that can pray for us, that we have a counseling center to help us process this stuff, that we have community groups where people can give us wisdom and wise counsel. So we want to avail ourselves of whatever it takes, Lord, so that we, as much as depends on us, can be at peace with the people around us. So speak to us now as we take some time in silence.